Welcome to Musings on Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix. Ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, comparative mythology enthusiasts, and last, but certainly not least, all of you that desperately cling to your confirmation bias. Whether your interest is Atlantis, Zeus, or anything in between, we tackle it all from our quantumly entangled castle tucked away in the ancient flood-battered central Pangaean mountain range. We're the one-stop shop for mystery, history, and comparative mythology. We're a podcast dedicated to exploring the ancient, mysterious, and unknown with logic and reason, and where we also theorize the fourth dimension exists and is the spiritual. I did so well in that intro and I messed it up on the end. Only trigger warning for this episode is a logical conversation, so if applying the Socratic method on fringe topics is disturbing to you, you'll want to turn off the podcast now. So, we are in the middle of a Mesopotamian mythology study, and I realized that I have someone that I know that's literally been to the city of Ur. It's a former guest from past times in the show, so I decided to have him join us once again to talk to us a little bit about the city of Ur, since that was in ancient Mesopotamia. So we have Colonel retired Dr. Doug Mastriano back in studio with us. How's it going, Pops?
Oh, yeah. It's good to be back.
Yeah, so, do you have a specific flow you're wanting to go through here, or were you wanting to talk about how you were in Ur first and your experiences there, and then go into the history of it? Okay. So,
the story starts in 1990, and the last Warsaw Pact Cold War exercise was happening, East Wind, the communists called it, in northern Germany. So I was the operations officer of my company in the 2nd Cav, so I organized a joint deployment with me and the Brits. That was a British zone up there in northern Germany. And while we're collecting against the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact, they had a little black and white TV in their secret site up there, the Brits, and I see a bunch of Iraqi tanks blowing into Kuwait City. And I'm like, man, that's messed up, but that'll never affect me. And just a few months later, of course, my unit gets mobilized with like another 100,000 soldiers out of Germany to deploy to Saudi Arabia. So I ended up in Iraq in 1991 during Desert Storm, 34 years ago this month.
Dang.
And after the big tank battle, the last great tank battle of the last century, Battle of 73rd Easting, we were the main attack. We led the main attack, all the 7th Corps behind us. We were trained to fight the Soviets. One Iraqi general we captured said it wasn't fair that you guys from Germany were trained to fight the Soviets who came here and fought us. Oh, too bad. We were really well trained. And then 82nd Airborne Division had been there since August. So, I arrived with my unit in December. I actually arrived on December 7th, not
nice.
1941.
Yeah.
Pearl Harbor.
Another historical date.
Yeah. And 82nd had been there for months. And so we called them the 82nd Busborne Division because they didn't jump in. And they were put on all these Egyptian and crabby buses, and it was so cold, and they looked miserable. So we took over their screening position on the Euphrates River. And not too far from where my headquarters was located on Euphrates was the ancient site of Ur.
So cool. So talk us through what it was like actually seeing it, what was visible still, and, maybe a little bit of what your working history knowledge was at the time, or even now looking back to kind of know what you were seeing specifically.
Well, when I saw that on the map, I was like, oh man, I got to go see it. So I talked to my squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson. I was like, yeah, go. And so me and a couple of my guys went up, and that part of Iraq, it's like a flat marsh plain. It's a flat desert usually, but that we had so much rain, God bless us with, so we could drive our tanks across the desert and not get stuck. And so it was real marshy, lots of gnats, these giant lizards, and they peeping their heads out of holes, look like dinosaurs on the horizon. Pretty featureless terrain. But off in the distance, you see this like man-made mountain, the ziggurat. I mean, it's really imposing. You see it from miles away, and you're like, oh, crap. You just get so excited as you're driving closer to it.
I'm curious, I don't know this off the top of my head, but how this compares to like the size of like the Giza pyramids. Is that supposed to be a lot smaller, or is it pretty similar in size?
So what's left of this is about 100 feet high, what's left today. The original was 200. How tall are the pyramids in Giza?
That's a good question. I'll let you keep going, and I'm gonna Google that real quick. Fact check.
So the original was 200 feet high. The current one is actually 98 feet high. On top of the ziggurat, of course, was a blue temple. What do you got?
454 feet
Dang.
for I think that's the original height of the Great Pyramid of Giza.
Wow.
So literally 4 times or double what the ziggurat originally was, 4 times
That's
what
nuts.
it is now. That's impressive. So, I mean, you have more perspective than anyone else here probably, unless we have any other listeners that have been to Ur, but I doubt that.
So, as I said, the terrain is just so flat there, and it's a very imposing structure, and we're told that across the millennia, people use that to obviously navigate. It was a point of reference where you're going in the desert there. Most people obviously would stay on the Euphrates River, which when the city was built around 4000 BC, 3800 BC, around 4000 BC, the river was right there. And so it was a thriving metropolis. The king that established it, I got to look at my notes here. These Sumerian names are hard to remember. King Ur-Nammu.
Sounds right. Yeah, probably on the Sumerian king list. So many names on there, it's hard to keep track of them all.
They were very modern and advanced. We want to look at these people from several thousand, 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, is kind of like 3,000 BC. And we're talking 6,000 years ago. It's kind of backward. They were so sophisticated. They had laws, they had regulations, they had taxes, they had urban centers, they had cities, they had pretty sophisticated farming abilities. The trade coming out of Ur, based off the archaeology, they found lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, from Badakhshan. I was there, Afghanistan, many times, and I have lots of lapis around the house here, as you know.
World traveled, yes.
And they have artifacts as well from Egypt they found there, as well as the artifacts from India. So it was a big hub while the city thrived.
Right. No, that's really cool, though. So, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, especially with everything we talk about on the show, that to be able to accomplish what they accomplished, they weren't just, some city bumpkins 3,000 years ago. They actually had, advancement and solid understanding of things. So that's really interesting. I mean, so looking at the ziggurat, do you think that could have just been built with manual labor or slaves, whatever you want to call it, and hemp ropes? Or do you think that there was, potentially something more? I know you're not an architect, you're a historian, but just kind of curious to get your thoughts on that, since you've actually seen something like that and you saw the megalithic blocks and everything.
So it's mostly bricks.
Oh, is it bricks?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And they would also, so there's no chambers. You would think, when I was first there, there's surely got to be a chamber in here, hiding something. No, it's solid all the way through. And so the bricks, and they would pack dirt in the middle of it as well. And then they would use bitumen, which is like a byproduct of oil. Today it's asphalt, and they would spread a bitumen on it to, of course, to weatherize it, to protect it from rain and what have you, and erosion.
Yeah, so this is what we see in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel, actually, is they build it with bricks and bitumen to cement it together. So it's exactly as you're describing. That's exactly how I described it back 30 episodes ago when we did that episode, is it's basically just, the ancient version of asphalt.
Yep.
So no, that's really cool. That's also what's used to describe the covering for Noah's Ark in the Mesopotamian mythology, as well, as they'll say that they, I think I'm getting this right. I might be slightly misquoting it, but I think it was Atrahasis where he was told to cover the top of the ark with bitumen and make it look like the depths of the sea. So make it impenetrable, if you will, just really dark covering of bitumen over it to ensure no water could get through. So no, that's really cool, especially when you see parallels like that. These things are getting repeatedly mentioned, to have sophistication to make bricks and to make tar. Yeah, I didn't realize it was just bricks. I thought there was some megalithic blocks involved. So no, definitely easy to do with manual labor then, as opposed to, some kind of more sophisticated technology. So no, that makes sense. Okay.
So when you go to the site there, obviously your eyes are drawn to the ziggurat. It's dominant. But then the ruins of a palace that I'm told that Nebuchadnezzar built is there. The foundations there of a palace. And some of the walls are still standing for Nebuchadnezzar's palace. Now, he's around 600 BC. An important figure in the history of Israel, of course, because he conquers Jerusalem and lays waste and deports a lot of the Jews, of course, to Mesopotamia after he conquers. Also, the cistern where they stored water there, it had caved in, so I could see in it, and you could see that they had a filtration system attached to it. It was a series very large potteries, or jugs, made out of pottery. And there was a series of like 4 or 5 together, and in between it'd have like sand and charcoal and stuff to filter out the water. So these were smart people.
Really, still like 2,000 years after the city's collapse, you could still see that.
It was there. I looked cool. Now, there was a chasm between me and that actual thing, and I couldn't get to it physically, but I could see from about 10 feet away where I was standing on the edge where the cistern collapsed in. I was like, wow. Filtration system. They don't want to get sick. They want to have amoebas in their drinking water, so they filter that crap out.
So, yeah, I know this from just like Eagle Scout and all that in my research into survival, but that's still something we use today is we'll use sand and charcoal and, what's it called? Gravel. To filter out, stuff from the water and you can do a couple layers of that. And I mean, that's like, you get your Brita filters. It's basically just a slightly upscaled version of that. It's just you're running it through like charcoal and all these other things, maybe slightly more advanced, chemicals or, products. But overall, it's the same concept. So that's pretty wild that, you're seeing that back, thousands of years ago still.
It was impressive. I was struck by the palace there because we in 2nd Squadron of my unit, the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, we had Chaplain White, who we've been with him a lot, another retired colonel, and he had done his studies in seminary on Ur, so he was giving tours to thousands of soldiers, in groups of 50 or so, but he was there giving tours all day long. And he took us to Nebuchadnezzar's palace, and he stood where Nebuchadnezzar would sit in the judgment seat, and there was a door to the left and right. And so the guilty party or the accused would come forward in front of Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar would make a judgment after hearing the facts. And if you were condemned to death, you go out the left door. Like with Jesus' parallel, you see the influence here of the culture. Jesus' parable about the goats going to the left to judgment and hell, and the sheep going to the right. To life. And if you were given, if you were allowed to live and you're pardoned or whatever, Nebuchadnezzar ruled in your favor, you go to the right, just like in Jesus' parable. So you see the influence of the cultures there as well. And that's with us today. Our law codes, some people think the Hammurabi law code is the oldest in the world. But actually the law code developed by King Namu was 300 years before Hammurabi.
Oh.
And Hammurabi, most people even quote it today, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That was Hammurabi, but he also may have borrowed from King Namu his law codes from 300 years before.
That's cool, because then there's a lot of stuff coming out too where... and we'll talk about this one in upcoming episodes, so I don't want to spoil this too much. But there's actually evidence of some clay tablets from the Mesopotamians having the Pythagorean theorem on it.
Wow.
Thousands of years, and that Pythagoras might have just stolen it from Mesopotamians. Well, like repurposed it and redelivered it to the Greeks, not intentionally stealing it. But this adds so many dimensions to it. So I'm going to ask you a question because I'm sure that skeptical listeners, which if we have skeptical listeners on this topic, I'm surprised they're still with us because I've beaten this topic so many times. But okay, so you're saying parallels in what Jesus' teachings are. So then does this lend to the idea of the Bible copying Mesopotamian myth and Mesopotamian influence?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you have traditions, you have culture that are passed around. Ur was a big trade route to people in Cana. The Jews weren't there yet. Abraham was still living in Ur 2000 BC, by the way. But you had the trade going on in Cana, in Egypt and India and Afghanistan. Of course, they're going to exchange cultural ideas. So a lot of the sayings passed down, of course, would be shared. But the ideas in the Bible are just so unique.
Yeah. No, I agree with you on that. I mean, we've hammered this so many times going through all the mythology things that we've gone through and even stuff that we're going to go through. There's not as many parallels as people think. But I did just want to ask that because that's where my mind was like, okay, now the skeptics are probably going to be asking this. But then what I would counter to the question that I asked you, because I wanted to get your thoughts before I started, saying my stuff, and throwing in my wild ideas. But, we are talking about Jesus's time, which would have definitely been post-Babylonian captivity. And so that influence still would have been fresh in their minds from the past couple hundred years and maybe even adopted into culture at that point from the captivity. But that doesn't take away from the historical validity of the Gospels, because this is historical benchmarks that we already have operating in time, as we've talked about on previous episodes with you with the Babylonian captivity. But yeah.
So What's intriguing to me about Ur is a sophisticated city. There's still ruins of the city are there, with alleyways and roadways and what have you. The palace is very predominant. As far as the temple itself, the ziggurat, it was designed to be a temple. And, it wasn't for public worship, though. Only the priests would be allowed to go to the top, to the blue part. So this is gone now. And there's still some pieces of the blue tiles you could find on the ground around the ziggurat. And of course, they worshipped the moon god Sin, or his name was Sin, or Namu. You can help me out.
So the moon god. So I was looking up a map of where exactly Ur is. We can talk about that. It says Sin, the moon god. There's a lot of different names you're going to find in Mesopotamian mythology that would vary from city to city, or the purpose and intent of a specific deity. Babylon, I think, is the main culprit in a lot of that, where they would actually change some of the names themselves. Yeah. As well. I'm familiar with Sin. Yeah.
His name is also Nana or Nana, the moon god. It's interesting. So he's depicted as this old guy with his long Sumerian beard, kind of a braided beard. And there's always a crescent moon above his head here. And you'll see the crescent moon on flags in the region there to this day.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, so he's in contrast to Shamash, who is the sun god, I believe.
Yeah.
But, well, let's take a quick pause here, because we run about 15, and then we'll come back and I'll try to reorganize my thoughts. I apologize to the listeners. I'm a little bit out of practice. I'm rusty. Batch recorded the last several episodes, so I'm still beating the rust off of my rhythm here. But hopefully come back strong after this short break. Echoes into the past, echoing to 1991, and then echoing further back still to 3000 BC. Here on Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix, we're talking about the ancient city of Ur, and I'm attempting to get my interviewing skills a little bit more together here so we can keep a more systematic motion here. But you wanted to break down a little bit more of the comparative mythology aspects, because I'm not as familiar with all of the minor deities, and it's hard to keep track of all of them. But you set off some names that I definitely recognized in comparison to Sin, the moon god.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, the ziggurat of Ur was designed to make it easier for Sin, or Nana, their small g god, the god of Ur, to come down and visit them. That was a point. Build it high, because it'd make it easier for their deity to come down to them. It's interesting that the famous Tower of Babel, which is about 60 miles south of Baghdad today, that was at least twice the height. So that was probably pushing 400, 500 feet in height. And the interesting thing, according to the biblical account here, is instead of making it easier for them, for their gods to come down, they wanted to elevate themselves as a god with that height, and that's why we see God's judgment in languages to confuse them, to babble. As far as the local deity here, so when the temple was being built, they dedicated to Sin. That was the king's favorite god, and he's viewed as the patron of Sin, Nana, and of course he was the son of Enlil, the god of air and storms. And the son of his mom would be Ninlil, the goddess of grain and deity. And according to their mythology, he fathered Shamash and Ishtar.
Yeah, so that rings a lot of bells for our listeners. So Shamash is referenced in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And Shamash is also going to be referenced in an upcoming episode where we're going to be talking about Etana, who ascends to the heavens on an eagle, or at least he attempts to. We'll see if he actually gets there or not. Enlil's another household name that we're very familiar with here as well, with what we've talked about with Atrahasis and Eridugenesis. So you have a lot of household names there, and then Ishtar or Nana, same deity as well. She's the one that comes down and tries to marry Gilgamesh after he defeats Humbaba in the cedar or pine forest, depending on how you want to translate it. So I just kind of helped draw some connections there for all of our listeners. And then he basically laughs in her face, and he's like, you've done wrong by all of these different lovers that you've held. Get out of here. I don't want you. And so she goes and pouts to heaven and gets the bowl of heaven to try to destroy Gilgamesh and Enkidu. But yeah, just some connections there for our listeners on some of those household names that we're familiar with from Mesopotamian mythology to kind of ground this a little bit more. So no, that's definitely really cool. So let's shift gears here a little bit though. Before we do, is there anything else that stands out that you saw when you were actually in Ur? From all your experiences.
I mean, it's a site. I know when the archaeologists about 100 years ago uncovered the royal tombs, they found a lot of artifacts that really have created an identity for Iraq. Of course, Iraq is a fake country created by the French and English during the First World War.
Right.
In 1916, the French and British decided to divide up the Middle East and create these countries like Syria, Jordan, Iraq that didn't exist. And so, the problem with the Iraqis with their foundation after World War I, Treaty of Versailles, 1919, was how do you forge an identity for a country that doesn't have any history? So when Saddam Hussein took over the country in 1979, he would identify himself as a modern day Nebuchadnezzar, which is interesting because he is not Sumerian, he's not Assyrian, which is further north by Nineveh. He's an Arab, and Arabs, of course, came out of the Saudi Peninsula. They invaded that territory, but it's interesting that despite that, he wants to identify as Nebuchadnezzar. So you would see coins and images and paintings with Saddam Hussein's face superimposed over Nebuchadnezzar's. So that's why Saddam Hussein in the 80s decided to rebuild Babylon, to rebuild the ruins. And there was he did some restoration of Ur and, of course, of Babel and other places here to build on its identity. Of course, he wouldn't last long, like most dictators don't. And the 2003 invasion by the United States of Iraq, of course, he was hunted down, and the Iraqis hung him.
Jeez. But I mean, this is interesting because then you see parallels with this kind of thing with like Napoleon as well. Where he's not French, he's Corsican, and so he's coming from a completely different country, and he's assuming the identity of being French to take command and have that prestige, if you will. So.
Yeah, like the Egyptians, most Egyptians are not Egyptian; they're Arabs from the occupation around 700 A.D. The Coptic Christians are the original Egyptians, they're the original inhabitants.
Interesting. So yeah, there's just been a lot of shifts all throughout history that many people just aren't aware of or familiar of. I'm not even fully familiar with all of that, and up in more recent times. But no, definitely some good insights. So. Let's start. I'll kind of, because I'm looking at a map here, so I'll kind of say where Ur is. So if you're looking at the, they didn't name the river on that one. Why did they not do that?
Euphrates.
Yeah, it's the Euphrates. Thank you. I thought it was, but I just didn't want to say that and be wrong. I didn't want to pull a Billy Carson. Dare I say it?
And then pout when someone calls you out on it.
Hey, you said it, not me. I'll sue you for that. No, just kidding.
Come at 2:00 in the morning, leave a notice, cease and desist letter.
Yeah, all right, yeah. Let's bring it back. I don't want to rack on Billy too much. I feel like he's got his fair share. All right, but yeah, so Ur is it's on the Euphrates and it's close to the Persian Gulf, just a little bit south of Baghdad. But Baghdad is on the Tigris River. But nowadays, Ur is not exactly on the Euphrates River. So why don't you explain to us about that and the downfall of Ur?
Yeah, so of course, the golden age of Ur was, underneath King Ur, Numa Ur. It's funny, his name even has the name Ur in it, King Ur-Nammu, around 3000 BC. So what happened? 2000 BC, we have Abram and his wife Sarai. These are their pre-conversion names, Abraham and Sarah. They're living in Ur, and it's still doing fairly well, actually. It's a pretty prosperous town, even 2000 BC. But of course, Abram gets the call to leave Ur, and eventually end up in modern-day Israel. And he's going to go north, follow the Euphrates River to Haran, stay at Haran for a while, and eventually follow the Fertile Crescent around through Lebanon into modern-day Israel, Cana, back then. It's a good thing he obeyed that call because some people allege that the Scythians did a raid, massacring a lot of the population. It's really hard to find evidence of a raid, though. But what we do know is the Elamites did invade and laid waste to the city as well. So he could very well, had he said, you know what, God, I'm not going there. It's a polytheistic region. The temple of a small g god and this whole pantheon of gods that the Sumerians worshipped, and Abraham is leaving all that behind to worship Yahweh. And it's interesting. So that raid and the Elamite attack began the decline of the city. Nebuchadnezzar, during his reign, 600 BC, he tried to rebuild it. So it was still thriving center, but not as much after those attacks. But what really destroyed the city was the Euphrates River shifted away. Now the Euphrates River is about a half mile or about a mile away. So when it was built, it was sitting on the river. And that area of Iraq, it's full of marshlands. I already alluded to it. And it's really bad between the Tigris and Euphrates River. Saddam Hussein drained a lot of it now. Actually, there was a group of Arabs living out there who believed in the teachings of John the Baptist. So some Jewish missionary got to them 2,000 years ago when John the Baptist, and they didn't have the full teachings of Jesus.
Oh, wow.
And they're called Marsh Arabs.
Huh.
And Saddam Hussein, rattled them out of there by draining the Euphrates River. They were living pretty isolated out there, kind of like how, West Virginia would be.
Florida maybe is a little bit more, at least before it got colonized and tamed with all the marshes that it has. But yeah, no, that's cool. So how does a river shift? Is this a pretty common thing?
My big soliloquy was that it's so marshy over there that it's easy to imagine rivers shifting and missing. We see the Mississippi River every few years actually shifts. Parts of the state now belong to another state and what have you because the river shifts real wide. So during a heavy downfall, heavy rain season, before there was dams and anything to control the rivers, it was not uncommon that the river would find an easier path to flow to the Persian Gulf. And so they were no longer on the trade route. It was inconvenient. There was no way to easily get to a ship, and so it just died. And for us, that's what preserved the city.
Huh. No, that's really cool. But no, it makes total sense because you have sediment deposits that are collected up because of the bends and the twists in a river. And those sediments will get picked up and moved somewhere else and pile up. And then you have the ebbs and the flows of the height of the river in rainy season versus in dry season. So I just wanted to ask that question to have you explain for our listeners a little bit more to understand why all of this happens as well. And, if this was just a freak of nature thing or if this was a pretty common thing. But, from what you're saying, it definitely is a more common thing for this to happen. It's not bizarre by any means.
No, it's not uncommon. I mean, you don't see massive shifts like that every day. That'd be like a century flood kind of thing where it actually shifts the river.
Right. Yeah, and that could have been just one of those major, floods that were local in the area as well that had an influence on it, around that time of, 400 BC approximately. But yeah, so Ur is a lesser known one from all of the other cities that we've been talking about. So Babylon would have been a lot further northwest to be specific, along the Tigris River, and then you would have had Nippur, would be between the Tigris and Euphrates, and Nippur is a big cultural hub for the Mesopotamians. That's actually, I think, where we get a good chunk of our literature that we've found is from Nippur. Not all of it. There's the library in Nineveh as well. But Nippur was a huge cultural hub for a lot of these cuneiform tablets to sit at, if my memory serves. And then we have Uruk, and that rings a bell for our listeners from Gilgamesh because he was the king of Uruk. So why don't you, I think you have some stuff on Uruk you can tell us in relation to Ur, which is pretty close together. They're not too far apart.
Yeah, so two Sumerian ziggurats that are prominent, the one in Ur that we talked about and the other one built in Uruk. The Uruk one is a bit smaller. It's about 40 feet above the surrounding plain, so it's about rappelling tower height. So.
Okay, so not huge by any means, but still an accomplishment in relation to other cities in the area.
Yep, and the thing that's different about these two particular ziggurats is they're both mud bricks and compacted sand with bitumen pushed around them, so that they're both basically the same engineering ideas behind them. Most of these are erected, when a king is feeling good about himself, like Ur-Nammu. He just defeated the Gutians. I don't even know who they are, and so he commissioned the building of the ziggurat of Ur in honor of his victory, but dedicated to his favorite god. And so it became a symbol of wealth for the cities when you had a prominent ziggurat. Of course, Babylon's ziggurat would shadow both of these with its massive height of 400 feet plus.
Right, and then the blue gates or whatever that are no longer, I don't think they're there anymore, right? No. They're gone. Yeah, so there's just a lot of stuff that we're missing too from these cultures. Yeah, and then it wasn't uncommon for each city to have its own specific deity. that would be connected to it or associated with it. I mean, you see this idea even amongst the Greeks and the Egyptians as well. So like Athens was named for Athena, and the Egyptians also had their version of it for their deity of wisdom. I forget her name, but it's in the Atlantis. It's in Critias, the Atlantis source. Right. They talk about it. The Egyptian priests talk about how Athena named it, and Athena was also their patron deity, and that's why I think the Solon felt so comfortable to go there. So this is definitely something you would see that's pretty common within polytheism, where a specific deity would be tied to each specific city. And then for the Babylonians, it was Marduk, and that's why the Enuma Elish focuses so much on Marduk's supremacy. In fact, the whole, and this is where, not to drag Billy Carson through the mud. I mean, he's got a lot of his stuff seriously wrong. He does poor research. I 100% think he still needs treated with respect and dignity and like a human being. And some people are not doing that. I'm not okay with that. That being said, I am going to address the factual and textual verbal criticism of what Billy claims, and he's wrong on a lot of his stuff. He says that the Enuma Elish in his debate was copied word for word. You look at it and it's not. The Enuma Elish is actually a pre-creation text for like almost halfway through, so it's about 3.5 of the 7 tablets. Then we have Marduk creating, and then the last of the 7 tablets is actually primarily just all of the other deities giving Marduk their names, quote unquote. So you'll recognize this one, Dad, from the biblical theme of how Yahweh and the power of names, right? Mm-hmm. So almost the whole 7 tablet of the 7 tablets of creation is all of these other polytheistic deities giving their names to Marduk, meaning that he is the one that controls them and has their power because he's the supreme deity that defeated Tiamat. Like, he's the one that won. So now all the other gods have to submit to him. And that's what the Babylonians built their worldview off of, to go out and conquer the world and bring order to the chaos of the world. That was their call to, we have a divine right to do this, to go out and to conquer everyone else and to bring order in from this chaos. So it all kind of weaves together and fits together.
And they had the culture and the sophistication and the laws to make it happen. And I mean, obviously, if you're in the Middle East, there's influences here. There's, Babylonian influence, Mesopotamian influence, Sumerian. There's, of course, strong influence from the Assyrians, who would rise much later, of course, than this period here and dominate this part of the world. And so the Fertile Crescent really became a route for invading armies, obviously.
Yeah, it's the bridge between 3 continents.
Yep.
If you wanted to go anywhere, you had to conquer that region. And that's why even in World War II, Egypt was such a big deal, is because of the Suez Canal and being able to bypass a whole continent to go to India. So no, it all ties together and all these cultures blend together, and it gets hard. I definitely can't keep track of it all, even with how I can normally retain facts. So there's so many rise and falls, ebbs and flows of, the kingdom shifts from here. I mean, the Sumerian king list talks about this, whether you want to take that as literal or whether you think it's more mythological and allegorical. But you see the kingdom go to this location and then this location, and there's a couple kings here, and then there's 1 king here, and then 10 kings from this place. It's a constant ebb and flow and exchange of power in the region. And that's before I started really studying all this stuff. I just thought of Babylon was like a temporary place that arose around biblical times, but no, it's a very ancient city that's been around as much as like Uruk and Ur, Nippur, all of these Eridu, all of these other places that have existed, as just that was their rise to power was much later than a lot of the other cultures.
And what's interesting from an archaeological perspective, in the 1800s, the higher criticism folks that we've talked about previously, they debunked the Bible, saying, and not only did they say that the Jewish laws and what have you were actually written during the exile in Babylon, but they also say that they said then that Babylon was a myth. There was no archaeological evidence for the existence of the city of Babylon. And so in 1917, as the British army was fighting across Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, fighting the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, there was a British general who saw these mounds in the desert, and they were stationary for a while, so he had his soldiers start digging, and they found Babylon. And then Saddam Hussein, of course, took that to the next level by rebuilding Babylon. Mm-hmm.
But no, it's like that's cool because, like, you look at that. When did you say that was again? Was that
1917?
1917. So we've only known about the existence of Babylon in accepted historical academia, like secular historical academia outside of like Christian scholars, for 100 years. How much more of ancient mythology has just been buried or lost or forgotten about, where there's a lot more truth to these than we think. Where a lot of these mythology accounts, they get chalked up to, oh, it's just an allegory. Oh, it's just this. Oh, it's just that. Stephanie Dolly, brilliant translator, but she wants to, drill down to around 3000 BC, ushers dates for when the flood would happen and say, well, there's no sediment deposits. What would that look like? You're defining what you're looking for before you even look.
Yeah.
You're defining what sediment deposits are going to look like. And if a global flood happened, and we've talked about this on the show already before, so this is a lot of repeat for our listeners, but you're going to have it's going to look different than like a local flood sediment deposit. The whole earth is going to be a sediment deposit. How do you quantify that? We have nothing to compare that to. So you're predetermining what you're looking for before you even find it.
Yeah, that's a definite bias there.
Yeah. And so you have to, it begs an important question, because I don't think every single literal detail in every single myth is absolutely true. But I think that there is a lot of truth that people tend to miss in these mythology accounts, that it's a lot more history than people want to realize. And just because we have lost information and there's no way to quote unquote academically verify it, it just gets thrown out instead of even being considered. And so, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that as a historian? Then we'll transition into another break here. Would you agree with that assessment, or do you think that I'm a little bit off base?
Just to discount something. All right, so for instance, higher criticism, those folks there who discount it, through early 1900s, that Babylon was a myth. It's just an allegory. You can't trust the Bible. And then you have, of course, that general, of course, from England doing a dig and then finding Babylon and the artifacts they recovered, the gates of Ishtar. I mean, it was incredible. The beauty of the city, the organization of it, the sophistication, the urban center, and it completely changed everything. And if that's not enough to convince you, of the truth of the Bible, I can't help you there, because just look at the facts. Like, you shouldn't need any convincing. Just look. I mean, these exist. Abraham lived in Ur of the Chaldeans when God called him. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's Abram and Sarai, his name back then, his Chaldean name, I guess.
I think we even have written documents from the Chaldeans as well to verify they were a specific people group that existed, because the one Sumerian king list, Genesis solves the Sumerian king list book, I forget the author's names, Eve something, but she cites how the Chaldeans used what was it? The word for that we interpret as 3,600 years, and she posits that it could be days because of a way that they've used it before the Chaldeans. So we have references to all of these cultures. Yeah. So to just say, oh, none of this happened, because none of it's real, you just haven't done enough historical research at that point. So
I mean, you've been to Israel, and there's people in America that will just even deny the existence of Jesus, and I don't. Whether you worship him or not is a different story. I worship him. But the fact that he existed is so clear when you're in Israel. But you have ignorant people in America and in Western Europe here just, he never existed. I mean, what? I mean, just go to Israel there. It's all around you. You can go to the spots. You can touch stuff. I mean, it's real. Even those that don't believe or, don't worship him know he was a man that walked the earth.
I mean, Islam, which is a religion contrary to Christianity, acknowledges that Jesus existed and that he was a prophet. That should give you an inkling that at the very least he probably was a real person, just that alone, but,
sure.
And all the other historical evidence as well.
So why do I say that? Because, we get Abraham in Genesis chapter 11 being called by God, to leave and to head towards Canaan. And the first mention of Ur in the Bible, when Abram and Sarai were in Ur of the Chaldeans. Mm-hmm. Like, whoa. And, so did Ur exist? Yes, I was there. Did the Chaldean people exist? Absolutely. These are facts. Yeah. These are real people that existed in a historic context.
There's so much that gets chalked up to myth because it doesn't fit the quote-unquote science of radiometric dating. Don't get me started on that one. All right, with that being said, let's take a quick pause here and we will come back. And you know what, ladies and gentlemen, I should have just kept it rolling because we had a great conversation we were having off air about all this stuff, and completely derailed, and now I've got to restart and my rhythm's off again. So I'm sorry for those of you that like the refined flow. This is not the episode.
So we were talking about Nimrod from the Bible.
Yeah, so we were talking about how names are relevant in Mesopotamian mythology. So we'll kind of back it up here a little bit more, and where it gets hard to I think that there are parallels between things like the Sumerian king list and the biblical genealogies, but it gets hard to put our fingers on why, because the perfect example of this is what we've studied already and talked about. And again, this might be repeat for the listeners. I apologize. But with the biblical figure of Noah, he goes by multiple different names in Mesopotamian mythology. It's Utnapishtim and Gilgamesh because Gilgamesh is seeking eternal life, and Utnapishtim means he that has been granted everlasting life. It's Atrahasis in the Epic of Atrahasis because Atrahasis is leaning into Enki, the god of wisdom, to survive calamities being thrown at humanity by Enlil, the storm god, judging humanity. Atrahasis means he who is exceedingly wise. And then you have Ziazudra, which means he of divine descent. There's a couple of different ways to translate it, but it flows from the Sumerian king list. And the Eridu-Genesis' intent in the way it's being written is there's a phraseology similarity between the Sumerian king list and the Eridu-Genesis about the kingship descending down. And so each of these stories, they change the name of the character to describe the trait about the character that is to be emphasized. And so it gets hard to actually delineate clearly who these characters are unless you have an extreme event like a global flood to say, okay, all of these are referring to what we would call Noah. But how do you do that with, so-and-so that just gets mentioned real quick in the Sumerian king list? You can't do that, especially, if they don't have any honorable mention in the biblical genealogy as well. So you're faced with a big challenge where a lot of this stuff probably connects more than we even realize and affirms itself. But how do we do that? I know some people want to say that Nimrod is Gilgamesh. I haven't really looked into a lot of the evidence there, but I don't see credence for that. There's not much that's said about Nimrod other than he's like a good hunter or something like that in the Bible.
Good hunter and great king of Babylon and commissioned the building of the Tower of Babel.
Yeah, okay, so if he's Babylon, geez, that was loud. My bad. Slam my elbow into the table there. But yeah, so if he's from Babylon, definitely not Gilgamesh then, because Gilgamesh is based in Uruk. And so there are points where I think this stuff connects, but I do feel like Christians sometimes get their own confirmation bias as well, and they'll try to jam things in to the Bible and make it fit with the Bible when it doesn't always quite fit. And I think is a little bit more dynamic. What are your thoughts? I know there's a lot.
A lot of this is, I agree, a lot of this is based off of our training. If you took a classic education, you were trained in really the Greek thinking, the Greek approach of logic and reason. I think it's fantastic. It's eternal kind of. But if you're from a different culture, things won't be linear. Things won't be necessarily specific. Like you said, changing the names, someone's attribute and trait, rather than using whatever name they were given, at birth. It's not unlike Native American culture. It's like Sitting Bull. Dad came out and he just had a boy and he saw a bull sitting out in the prairies, and they might have done that, or White Cloud, or
no, true. But then let's flip this on its head, because we can add a whole nother layer to this. So like when you go over to more like the demonology and Satanism aspect, names have a lot of meanings for demons as well in a lot of traditions, where if you know the name of a demon, you can control it, at least in theory, if you go down that more occult mentality. So you have a lot of different ways to think about just names beyond just what we quantify as names in our modern, American culture.
And our naming is not in the Greek style; it's in the Roman style. First, middle, and last name. That is Roman. That's Latin. And so we see the influence of cultures even on us, even how we name each other.
Yeah, and then the existence of surnames as well, as having like a last name. Last names weren't so much a thing back then because, there were so few people in comparison that you didn't need to have a last name to delineate. Now we have John Smith and so many John Smiths that it gets hard to delineate which John Smith you're talking about. But,
and that's the cool thing about names too, they have meaning. And so, Mr. Smith, his ancestors in the Middle Ages, they were Smiths.
Yeah.
The tailors, guess what the tailors did?
Tailored.
The Mastrianos were maestros, or they were masters of their trade, which is really a cool name. So we're like better than professor, aficionado, maestro. I don't even know a good English translation for Mastriano.
Yeah, no, it is cool. But it's hard to quantify all of this stuff because there's just, and I just did a video on this recently on the channel talking about the translation of rib in Genesis 2:21 for Eve's creation, but there's so many different dynamic aspects to translation and other linguistics, it's hard to actually quantify something in English. A lot of times things get translated and it is the best word choice if you really look at it and you study the context, but our word just doesn't do it justice and there's no better word for it. And this is a challenge. You're bilingual as well. You speak German better than I do. You know this, very well, even with a simple language like German in comparison to English, where English comes from German in part. There's still so much that's missed, and that from translating from one to another. And so then you add something in like Hebrew, Chinese, Japanese, how much meaning is lost there, especially when you're going back into more ancient times. You're missing the ancient context of everything. And then you go back to something like cuneiform, where there's like almost nothing like it that exists anymore. It's like, how do you quantify this stuff? It gets very challenging.
Yeah, without, especially a dead culture, thankfully, we still have Assyrian people. There's still Assyrian populations in Syria. They're Christians. They're under great risk right now with the new radical regime that took over Syria. But if many of these cultures don't exist anymore, so you're really superimposing ideas and stuff to try to understand them. So that's really daunting. With German, we lived in Germany for many years. We get an appreciation for the German culture, the language, the dialects, the meanings, the people behind it. It's easier to understand that. But you're right. When you're dealing with Oriental cultures, foreign cultures outside of Europe, you really have to change your thinking. This is one problem that I think us in the West, especially Americans, have in grappling with Russian diplomacy, especially during the Cold War. Russia really led the Soviet Union, which was a group of nations that the Soviets took over under the Russian Empire. You think about Russian history. Of course, we have the Scandinavians, the Vikings going through there, the Slavic. And what about the Mongolian and other Eastern raiders that occupied and stayed? And so I think Russia thinks and looks a lot like Westerners, but there's also a lot of influence of Oriental thinking and logic and reason as well.
They're a good mix of the two, I'd say. Yep. And some Russian thinkers that would tackle these topics would probably have a little bit of an edge even to be able to kind of bridge the gap, if you will, to understand both ways of thought very easily and intuitively, more so than you and I would, from the Greek school training that we have.
Yep, I agree. And there's, of course, Greek influence, because the Russians, they saw themselves really, the Greek Orthodox Church. Of course, when Byzantium collapsed, they changed it to the Russian Orthodox Church and claimed them to be the inheritors of the Greek denomination of Orthodoxy, and also the inheritors of the Roman Empire. When Byzantium fell and Constantinople fell, I've got to use the city changed name so many times, Byzantium, yes. Constantinople under the great emperor who opened up the doors of Christianity in the Roman Empire. When it fell to the Muslims in 1458, of course, then the Russians are like, well, we're the inheritors of it. So everyone wants to be also now the modern-day Roman Empire. So the Russians claimed that, and the Germans did as well underneath the Holy Roman Empire in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
That was a stretch for the Germans.
That was a big stretch. Yeah. No, this is good stuff though. So I mean, we went down this rabbit hole. I'm trying to think trying to dig us back out of the rabbit hole.
Started with Nimrod. So, but namings. Okay, so we got the name Nimrod from the Bible. And he was so proud and arrogant, he thought he wanted to become like God and build this tower 400 plus feet high. And of course, languages were introduced to confuse them so they could stop the building. It's interesting though, because Nimrod came from a great heroic hunter, a brave hunter, and great king. But now, if somebody calls you a Nimrod, that means you're dim-witted and stupid. The irony.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I mean, think about the difference, too, of like Benedict Arnold, that's someone much more recent in our history, that betrayed the United States in the Revolutionary War. If Britain had won, how much different would, you're a Benedict Arnold. You're loyal to the cause. You're more loyal to the cause and to the royalty than you are to your own country and your own upbringing. It would have a sign of respect, but, because we won, they lost. Sorry, English, it has a negative connotation here. And someone says is it Arnold Benedict or Benedict Arnold? I forget.
Benedict Arnold.
Okay, Benedict Arnold. Thank you.
You got it.
Yeah. If someone calls you a Benedict Arnold, they're calling you a traitor, a backstabber, and a loser. And there's just so many things. I mean, even within the Bible, and we were analyzing this a couple episodes back, when you're looking at Genesis 1 and 2, there's different names for God that are used from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 that indicates it had different authors from different regions of Israel that were then combined and synergized together to give us the account that we have today. And so you have this huge interplay of different names that are used so many times all across culture. It gets really hard to quantify, like even just the Babylonians themselves, like changing the names of Inanna to Ishtar. Like that's very commonplace where there's like the listeners have heard me go through mythology, and sometimes in an account I'll list off 2 or 3 different names throughout the account and be like, this is all the same person, but he or she is referred to as this and this. Enki is also referred to as Ea. But yeah, you have it's all over the place.
So, I mean, the history of the region is just incredible, and I'm glad that in modern times here we're getting more and more of the truth of the Chaldeans. Ur's ancestor, Abraham, the founder of the Jewish and Christian religions, belief systems, he must have been Chaldean since he was from Ur. There's no indication otherwise. So he's got deep Mesopotamian roots, and moved to Haran until God said, look, I called you to go to Canaan, not to hang out in Mesopotamia. And so then he continued his journey to modern-day Israel. Did a short stint in Egypt, right? And then the Pharaoh was flirting with his wife, and judgment came, and the Pharaoh's like, I didn't know she was your wife. And yeah. You told me she was your sister. Yeah. So back to Cana he goes.
Yeah, because he was scared for his life, and so he's like, "Oh, she's my sister. She's not my wife. You can hang out with her." I'm like, dude, really?
That forced him back to Cana finally, though.
But yeah, no, this gets us back on track here. So I think this is where we were going after that last break, and then I kind of derailed us with my long tangent. A history of Ur and Abraham. I mean, give us a quick rundown of what you got for that.
So when I knew we were moving to the Euphrates River to relieve the 82nd Airborne Division so they can go home after the war, I was just so excited because I became a Christian as a teenager of my own choice. And when you're reading in Genesis chapter 11, Abraham, was called from Ur of the Chaldeans. I was like, crap, I'm going to go there. The ziggurats there. And to see that was just so impressive. So if you think about it, give me a second here. Sorry.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, dead air is a bad thing for podcasts.
It is what it is. Usually at this point, I'll just throw something at my co-host and be like, say something smart real quick. And it's usually fun to watch him squirm a little bit and say something to cover for me while I research. So
Genesis chapter 11, verse 31. And Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, Abram's cousin, right?
Yeah.
Or nephew.
I think it was nephew, yeah.
Nephew. The son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. I'll put a but. There's not a button here, but they came unto Haran, and they dwelt there. And the days of terror were two, etc. So to be at that ziggurat, knowing that Abraham stood in the shadow of it, probably walked the steps up there, hung out in the city. The palace wasn't there yet. That was Nebuchadnezzar well after Abram. Abram was 2000 BC. It was just such a thrill. And this really affirms what you believe when you're seeing it. It's tangible. Ur existed. Abram is from Ur. There's a ziggurat that he would have seen. It had already been standing for 1,000 years when he was there. I mean, incredible. And it's still standing today.
Yeah. It is definitely mind-blowing. So kind of giving a quick rundown of Abraham then, because I didn't really look into this so much, but he's originally, again, so we come to names, he's originally Abram, and then it gets changed to Abraham because he's going to be the father of many, and that's what God tells him he's going to be. And then they bounce from after, you said Haram, they bounce over to Egypt, like you said, and then eventually they end up in Israel. And then is there anything else I missed there, anything major you wanted to hit?
No, I mean, he spent quite a bit of time before he got to Egypt in Cana, talking with the local, it was city-states. Ur was a city-state. There really no big kingdoms yet.
That's pretty much how it was across the world at that time, yeah.
So when he got to Canaan, he got along with the local rulers, bought some land, but, ended up going to Egypt for a bit. And, because of that, what we already talked about, he had to go back to Cana and then settled there and had a son. And then his sons would have many more sons and daughters. And and we see the promise, of course, he didn't have a child who was really old, Isaac.
Yeah.
And, of course, Isaac's descendant would stay in Israel, and then Jacob's descendants after him would stay as well. And then that's the birth. Abraham is the father of modern-day Israel, and it all came out of Ur.
Yeah. And so that's really cool. That kind of grounds everything, we understand about biblical theology and history in our studies of Mesopotamia here, in a sense. And there was an interesting thought I had, and I just lost it. City-states, that's what it was. So that's interesting. I think, because we just made the statement there that there really were no empires or countries or anything. at that point. And I think that's actually a very interesting observation to make. I think we should expand on that a little bit, because in all of history, I mean, maybe there was and we've just lost record of it, but our current understanding of history indicates that there was no major empires from 2000 BC on, right? Like going back like 2000 to 3000, because that's about as far as we have. There's nothing concrete. Now you could argue Atlantis might be dated that far back. I think that's a mistranslation with the Mycenaean timeline, but we'll get into that more with Atlantis. But looking more at empires of antiquity, we don't really see the existence of many. I mean, maybe I'm mistaken here. I know you're not an expert in ancient antiquity in history, but feel free to jump in if there's anything I'm missing.
Yeah, I just want to. It's been so long since I talked about Sargon of Akkad, and he's considered to have the first empire. And so Sargon, let me look at the dates here, because like you said, I'm not an ancient history guy. But you do take these courses, of course, getting the PhD and what have you. The oldest known empire in history was the Akkadian Empire around 2300 BC in Mesopotamia. So we had these city-states first, just like in Greece. And Greece would have the city-states much longer and later. But Sargon was able to develop a military system and occupation as well, where he would conquer a vast swath of lands. King Ur-Nammu, it was city-states, but he still fought and conquered neighboring territories, but it was a really vast empire like Sargon did.
Right. And I think this is an interesting question to ask. I mean, the reason I'm fixating on this is because I have kind of like a realization here. If you don't have a lot of pre-existing empires, that kind of, it's very focused on city-states all around the world. From our understanding of history, that very much indicates the beginning of civilization. And that lends credence to the idea of a flood. Now, of course, if we're just looking solely at this piece of evidence, that could be other things too. You could spin this from an evolutionary perspective or whatever if you want. But as civilization advances more, you really work out of those city-states where, yes, you still have your pride of your local cities, like New York City. New Yorkers are very proud of the city they live in, generally speaking. And you see that all around the world. But we've really worked out of that in the society we're in now because we're so established. But as you're first establishing yourself, you have a lot of pride in the city that you're from. Yeah. And there's a lot of control that's local to that one city. And then other cities, you go somewhere else and it's totally different rules. It's a lot different than it is now. And I just think it's interesting because you don't see the remnants of an empire, besides what you listed with Sargon. So that does really indicate the beginning and establishment of civilization, whether you want to say that it's a flood. Like, what are your thoughts on this? I'm just trying to think about what this tells us in looking at ancient history.
So what compelled Sargon to expand beyond just the neighboring territories and to have a vast swath of land that he would occupy, with this Akkadian empire? Well, first off, obviously, was his technology, but more importantly was his military organization. So he had, I would say, an active force of military and tactics and what have you. And so he's able not only occupy, but then he would bring the language and culture of the Akkadians with him. And so he's really, in a lot of ways, the first empire conquering neighboring territories that are more than Akkadians. He's conquering Chaldeans. He's conquering Hittite territory and what have you, and he's bringing his culture with him. You're going to speak my language. You're going to write like I write here. You're going to listen to my music and what have you. And so we're going to see that play out. Almost simultaneous, but maybe a bit after. Of course, we have the Egyptians expanding. In modern day Egypt. The Coptic people are those, not the Arabs that are there mostly now. And we have the Hittites in Asia Minor, parts of southern Turkey along the Mediterranean coast. They begin expanding and become a nemesis to Israel as well.
Yeah, and we'll be hitting on the curse of Agade down the road here, a couple episodes down, and that was Sargon's grandson, I think, is a figure that exists in that. So this all ties in as well to, where we're looking at this. And this is really the fringe and beginning of civilization. But then you also got to look at stuff like Turkey, around where Noah's Ark supposedly landed. And there seems to be an establishment of civilization there with Göbekli Tepe. And then there's other tepes as well that exist out in that region that I think are indicative of building like big monolithic buildings, because that's Göbekli Tepe is some pretty big, hefty stones to move.
Yep.
So yeah, and then So another interesting thing, and let's take a break because I want to look this up real quick before we talk about this, and then that'll lead us into the final segment here because I want to do this justice. So stay tuned. I got some more thoughts to interject here, and we'll be right back. And we have returned, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers. So what I was looking up was Exodus 5:7 in the ESV. It was talking about Moses is trying to come back and get the Israelites out of Egypt. You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks, as in the past. Let them go gather straw for themselves. So I wanted to hit on this because you had said that the ziggurats were made from bricks, but they're making bricks here. Bricks are easier to make and move the megalithic blocks. So this is interesting because I'm not sure the exact date of Moses, but I want to say that was around 2000, 1500 BCE, approximately, something in that range, kind of guesstimating off the top of my head. But it's interesting because you see, I think that's pretty close to when they're saying some of the pyramids were built. So if you can build pyramids with bricks, as we see in Ur and Uruk, why wouldn't you build pyramids with bricks unless you wanted longevity and maybe it was even easier for you? And I think that this begs a deeper question about maybe the pyramids are a lot older than we realize, and maybe there was technology that existed that we don't realize, because you see this mirrored with things like Göbekli Tepe. And so then you got to ask, is this the remnants of an ancient empire we've just lost record of entirely? Or is this just knowledge that was passed down that disseminated after like a global flood? But you have to ask these questions, I think, and that's where mainstream science does a major disservice to a lot of people, where it steps outside of its field and it says that this thing did or did not happen historically with very faulty methods, that there are stacks of assumptions in, and it just I asked ChatGPT to run a logic test discussing some of like the radiometric dating stuff, and it's like I asked it like, is this like a logical? Let me actually pull this up real quick because this was an interesting one. So I was looking into dating methods a little bit more because of some stuff going on. And I asked it to run a logic test about radiometric dating. And it came to the conclusion that radiometric dating is not purely scientific from a logical standpoint, which is supposed to be something ChatGPT largely excels at. And that there's a lot of outliers that get thrown out because it doesn't align with what they expect it to be. And it poses a question at the end I think is phenomenal. Would we trust a method this uncertain in engineering, medicine, or physics? Likely not. It's like, but no, seriously, that puts it into perspective. Like, I wouldn't want to use a science like radiometric dating to have surgery. No, thank you. Like, people are just taught that this stuff is reliable. In reality, there's so many assumptions. It's an educated guess. And we have whole episodes on this if you want to go listen to it more, or email us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com, and I will happily tackle your logical and thought out questions. But if you attack me with ad hominem, I will make fun of you on the show. I will say that right now.
You know, it's interesting when Abram and Sarah arrived in Canaan, in Genesis 15:20, it says, so God is promising Abraham, now his name is Abraham, to his descendants. It's funny, the Hittites are mentioned, the Amorites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites, which they occupy Jerusalem. And so we see the Hittites and others, Abraham's going to live peacefully amongst these various tribes. But the Hittite, when Sarah dies and Abraham wants to buy land to bury his wife, he interacts with Ephron the Hittite, and he buys Ephron's cave near Machpelah. And so the Hittites are already spread out across the region as part of the earlier empire that had expanded.
Mm. So you do have traces of empires starting to expand a little bit, but nothing like we would understand like the Roman Empire or Alexander the Great or anything like that, just smaller kind of little blips of city-states pushing past to take over a couple cities or something like that.
Yeah, that's initially. The Hittites did expand pretty far. They went as far as, southern Israel. Obviously, Egypt. The Egyptians were very difficult to conquer, and so very few would with the desert. And there's a thinking that Philistines. The Philistines, actually, they're Greek people, we're finding out. These are the Philistines that were thorn in the side of Israel for thousands of years. They were called the Sea Peoples, and it's believed they first invaded Egypt, and they were thrown back by the Egyptian army. So then they got on their ships and boats and went over to Israel, and then occupied the coastal areas around Israel. We visited some of their ancient cities, and there's massive walls and what have you they had in that one city by Ashkelon, and these are ancient people here, and here we had a foreign invader building this vast city that still stands today, some of the artifacts.
Wow. And that was the Phoenicians, right, that were believed to, or am I getting that mixed up?
The Phoenicians are from Lebanon, so these are really the Greek people.
Okay.
The Philistines. Of course, we get the word Palestine from the Philistines, who were foreign invaders. The Israelis had already been there for 1,000 years. Abraham... kind of like a Bedouin kind of lifestyle. And, and then finally, after Abraham, Isaac, and when Jacob has a dozen kids, right?
Yeah.
He's 12 kids. They stay. They're there to stay.
Yeah.
And they become, a less Bedouin in their lifestyle here and start building cities and what have you.
At least until they go to Egypt to live over in Egypt after the famine takes over and everything because of Joseph. Yeah. And then you have the Exodus. So a lot of stuff at play here. One final thing I want to hit on, unless you have anything else, then we'll do a conclusion.
Yeah, thank you for that clarity there, because there was a time when they left Israel and moved to Egypt, thanks to Joseph being a favorite of Pharaoh at the time. And then, of course, after several hundred years, 400 years living in Egypt,
yes,
they would of course have their exodus back and then stay forever in Israel. Yeah,
and they had trouble settling down because one of the local princes liked the daughter and did some inappropriate stuff, and they went in and killed him and his whole family. And that didn't set well for having peaceful relations in the region. And so then they had to kind of move on. So they did still kind of have that Bedouin lifestyle a little bit, and then they tried to settle down, and then a famine hit, and then they had to move out. So just kind of building off of what you're saying there. Final realization I had, because I was thinking about a lot of progressing, because I've read the Bible through numerous times, but I was kind of progressing through like Genesis and the early times, thinking about Abraham, and other things that happened. And I had a major realization based off of a lot of the theories we build off of on here. And I've already told this to you, but it'd be cool to get your thoughts on air. Sodom and Gomorrah. Most Christian circles will chalk it up to it was the sin of homosexuality. Now, I'm not going to get into all of that and that whole Christian theology on it, but that is a fact that most Christian circles will chalk it up to homosexuality as the reason Sodom and Gomorrah were being judged. I don't think that's it. Having studied what I've looked into, I think it goes exponentially deeper. I think Sodom, because you got to keep in mind, in these ancient cultures, the Genesis 6 world was still very fresh in their minds. What happened with Sodom and Gomorrah? They were to the point where two angels went in to get Lot and his family out, related to Abraham. They go in to get him out. And these people in these cities, they wanted to, I'm not talking in vague terms here because I didn't put a disclaimer on this episode, but they wanted to know the angels, inferring the same way that Adam would have known his wife Eve to begat a child. So hopefully that's vague enough for our listeners with any little ears present. But they wanted to interact with these angelic beings that God sent. And I think that speaks to the depravity, not so much in terms of that homosexuality aspect, but even to a deeper sense that God brought on severe judgment because I think they were trying to get back to that Genesis 6 world that we read about. And I think that's the same reason, in part, I think the arrogance is true for your Tower of Babel perspective, but I think also in part that the attempt of the Tower of Babel was attempt to breach the heavens potentially as well. And so you have all of these things where I think you see these themes keep occurring and God has to keep stomping it out because there's this twisted nature of wanting to intermingle human flesh with the angelic, and that's not supposed to happen. And God is trying to stop that from happening because then he has to severely judge that when it happens. And then you have this thing, it gets to the point where we've forgotten about this, and then you have Augustine of Hippo that wants to downplay it and just be like, oh yeah, well the Bible says it, but that couldn't have happened basically, so I'm going to say it didn't happen. And it's like, well, who are you to say that couldn't have happened? Anyway, listeners know my rant on that if they've listened to those early episodes, but I think a lot of this connects more than we realize. And we see all of these interplaying of ideas with, with all these demigods. And I think, what you're pointing out as well with, Goliath likely coming from Greek descent. You see the Olympic pantheon and these giant demigods. What are Nephilim referred to? The men of great renown. They were large, gigantic beings. It all starts to fit together, where this stuff might have actually been real. Very real, and happened to the point where it was very prevalent in ancient society. And so you've got to look at all this stuff and be like, how much of our past are we really missing here looking at everything? Just because it's not recent and fresh in our minds within the last few thousand years and it's been so lost to ancient history and antiquity. What really is going on? And that's where I do think, people like Billy Carson do have the right idea to ask questions and to think about this. But you've got to do a logic and reason and consistency. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I find it interesting. So, being in NATO, I get to work with, I had worked with people from many nations, obviously. That's the nature of NATO.
Right.
And in Afghanistan, and I worked with him also in Germany. I had a Greek. He was like not my deputy, but kind of like my XO, so the third in command after me. And he was from northern Greece, Thrace. They claim that Achilles, the famous Achilles tendon, he's
right.
a strong, brave warrior, but he had one weak spot, his tendon.
Yes.
They claim that Achilles was from that part of Greece, and big. And to this day, most of the men from Thrace are big, strong guys. This guy was a giant. I felt like a tiny. When he came one day in to talk to me in Afghanistan, he was angry about something, and he's waving his giant gorilla hands in my face. And there's this old commercial from the 70s where they took a American Traveler or Samsonite luggage, and they put it in a gorilla cage, and the gorilla's like kicking it, biting it, throwing it, tossing it, and it won't break. And I pictured myself as that piece of luggage in my friend's hands. And I said, brother, it's okay. Whatever you want to do, I authorize it. And then he went from rage to crying, thank you. But these, there are traits. Lithuanians, most Lithuanian men, I feel small around. I'm 6'2". I'm 200 and some pounds. These guys a lot of them are giants around me. I'm glad we're in NATO together because there are traits even from these people groups that are just, biologically different from us as well.
Yeah. I mean, you think about that in contrast to a lot of Oriental cultures and how, generally speaking, a lot of more Oriental people will be on the shorter side. And obviously, there's exceptions, but generally speaking, and there's pictures of people that will go over to the Philippines or whatever, and they're from Norway or something like that, and so they're 6'6", and they're standing next to these 4'11" people, and it really contrasts our understanding of what giants are as well.
So my grandma, my maternal grandma, so all the Mastriano boys were all 6 feet plus or so, and anyway, my maternal grandma was 5 feet tall. So some of it's diet based too.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yes.
I don't know where the genes went different here. Obviously.
Yeah, that's a whole nother rabbit hole I think we're limited to on time for this episode.
Way off topic.
Yes.
The bottom line is don't be a Nimrod.
Oh, boy. Well, let's do a little bit of a recap here for our listeners to kind of help everyone digest, because I apologize. This was a little bit more of a tangential episode, but it's just going to be the nature of the beast sometimes, especially with a guest, and we're exploring and connecting a lot of ideas here. So we started talking about your experience in Desert Storm in Ur, and then we transitioned to talking a little bit more about the history of Ur and connecting it to the broader region and understanding of the region and mythology of that area to connect it for our listeners so they kind of can fit it all together a little bit more. And then from there, we went into a little bit more of Abraham's history and some more tangential biblical theories about Sodom and Gomorrah, and then you have the Tower of Babel, and then you have the idea of city-states and what this tells us about our past history, and then you have the building of bricks as well, and why there's such an emphasis on the building of bricks. It doesn't mean that they didn't have megalithic tools and uses at that point. Maybe it was just more for their houses they were using the bricks, but it does beg the question, what were they building if they were making stuff from bricks? And where did all that stuff go? Maybe at this point, the pyramids were already there. There's some people that theorize the pyramids were pre-Egyptian culture even, or at least pre-Egyptian culture as we understand it from, 4,000 years ago. So I think that's a good recap of everything that I've talked about. Did you have anything that we talked about that was worth recapping, or anything else that you wanted to add in the final thoughts here before we do closeouts?
I think you covered it. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, good to have you back. I am sorry, listeners. I meant to do all this stuff at the beginning, and I totally got derailed. I was away for work for a couple weeks, and I'm off my game. But I will say, we were going to try to go live with this episode, and YouTube shut me down on that because apparently, I didn't realize this, but you have to have 1,000 subscribers to be able to go live, which is frustrating. I'm irritated about that. I'm going to leave it at that because, I'm not overly happy about that, but it is what it is. So we couldn't go live. We're 14 subscribers short of 1K as of recording this on February 11th. So if you're listening and you haven't subscribed and you found some benefit in this content, give a subscribe on YouTube. YouTube's kind of our hub. Post short form videos, long form videos, breakdowns, and the podcast all on YouTube. So if you're not on YouTube, you're missing out. Go check that out. Go give us a like, give us a subscribe, and you'll help us get there and hopefully be able to do our first live episode at some point down the road. We were going to do Q&As live too, but that got derailed because we couldn't go live. So it is what it is. I think we still got some great content here. These are some good questions. These are some good topics. So, yeah, that's all I got. So you can email us m.quad.musings@gmail.com. Tell us how wrong we are. Send us your confessions, concessions, snide remarks, whatever you like about the show, whatever you dislike about the show. This is an ongoing conversation, an ongoing quantum conversation about life and our history and the mysteries that we face in our world. So you can find us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. m.quad.musings is our handle across most platforms. Musings and Mysteries Mythical Matrix Facebook. Did you want to plug in any of yours? I know, so our guest is a political figure, but we're not supporting or denying support for any political position. We're apolitical here on MQuad. But did you want to plug any of your content?
No.
Okay.
I'm good.
All right. So
I got like 800,000 followers.
Oh, okay,
4
yeah.
pages. I'm
yeah.
good.
So you're bringing the support here. It's not the other way around. But yeah, so all right. So that being said, whether you've been listening on the earth, above the earth, or below the earth in the depths of Sheol, we thank you for tuning in on this fine quantum snowy afternoon as we sit nestled into the ancient central flood-battered Pangaean mountain range. And we hope you have a good rest of your night.